All right, it's a huge honor to introduce Ron Tozer. I think he's no stranger to a lot of you guys here. You've seen his book, Birds of Algonquin. He was a park naturalist for 25 years. I'm a huge fan because I actually once was a bird bander. I actually banded birds. I didn't do well. I was finally given the job once to band on my own. My boss said, okay, you're good enough. We're going to leave you with the birds for the day. We'll see you at the end of the day. I got the birds out of the bag that we caught in the trap. It was a duck. It was a green-winged teal. I sexed it and I aged it. I shouldn't explain that. I ended up, it was a green-winged juvenile female, and I threw it up to the ground, up in the sky to release. It fell to the ground and died. I was like, oh my God, it's got a federal ban on it. I'm in trouble. My boss comes in, he goes, Kevin, what happened? I went, well, I don't know. It was a green-winged teal. I sexed it and aged it, and it's a juvenile. And he goes, it's a juvenile. It can't fly yet, you idiot. Ron is more of an expert than I am. Take it away, Ron.
Thank you, Kevin. I'd also like to thank all the friends of mine that I met in the audience that were very skeptical that I could give a talk of 25 minutes duration, since my introductions are usually 25 minutes. Thank you for the support. I'm going to give you a whirlwind tour of what I'm calling changes in Algonquin Park bird life, and it will be rapid enough, I hope. Some of you may not be familiar with the location of Algonquin Park. It's northeast of Huntsville, between Highway 11 and the Ottawa River. It's big, the third largest provincial park in Ontario now, and the oldest. Algonquin Park was established in 1893, and it's on the southern edge of the Canadian Shield. 7,630 square kilometers. There may be some people here on the old scale. 3,000 square miles. Larger than the province of Prince Edward Island. Not as many senators. And larger than the state of Delaware. There are high elevations of 585 meters on the western part of the park, and this is significant from a bird point of view because that higher elevation, 200 meters above the surrounding country, is just like being located much farther north. So we get a mix of birds in Algonquin Park of the northern boreal forest and the southern hardwoods. Yes, I am here to shill a book. But today's talk is based on information in this book, which took me about 20 years to research and write. That gasp you heard was my wife, who pointed out it would be good to be alive when it came out. And seemed to be suggesting that if it didn't come out soon, I might not be. Therefore, in April of 2012, the Friends of Algonquin Park published this book. And it covers all 278 species that were at that time ever recorded in Algonquin. As soon as you publish a book, people try hard to find a new species, and they have, the 279th being blue grosbeak. Most of the book is made up of species accounts like this that deal with arrival and departure in spring and fall, breeding activity, and then sections on historical status and especially population trends. And much of what we're going to briefly talk about today deals with population trends. I've picked out a series of a series of changes, and I'm just going to run through them quickly. Obviously, when you have a park that was established in 1893, you would expect some habitat changes by now. By the 1830s, Euro-Canadians had worked their way up the Ottawa Valley and the tributaries of rivers flowing into it in search of pine. And as early as the 1830s, they were in what later, 60 years plus later, would become Algonquin Park. They operated out of these camboose camps. They cut down the virgin white and red pine that they found, and they squared it into square timbers, which were floated down to Quebec City, put on a ship, and sent to England. In the squaring process, you leave 1/3 to 1/2 of the fiber of a pine tree in the woods. This results in a tremendous infusion of fuel And human and lightning-caused fires burned very extensively after logging began in the 1830s. So, when the park was established in the 1890s, vast areas of the park looked like this, not the forest primeval. What's going on here is that men with primitive tools are constructing the Ottawa, Ironprior, and Parry Sound Railway across the southern end of Algonquin Park in the 1890s. There are some stumps visible where the land has been denuded of its big trees, and there has been fire. And this constitutes early Algonquin Park forest. Large areas looked like that. And obviously, this was very much early successional stuff as far as birds were concerned. We often have people in the park today say, boy, I wish I could have been there when the park was started in 1893. The trees must have been like redwoods. Not. However, this condition over large areas of the park persisted for a surprisingly amount of time. Here is the same railway, pictured in 1929. The area, for those of you who know the park, is between Cache Lake and Lake of Two Rivers. And here is the forest primeval. Blueberry, grass, sedges, the odd scrubby little tree, and that's it. Now, especially near the railway, this kind of terrain was prominent because we were talking steam locomotives, and they started lots of fires. But there were large areas of the park where fire burned and was not controlled and burned over extensive areas. If we look at the same area between Cache Lake and Lake of Two Rivers, namely the big trestle over the Madawaska River, in 1950, the steel has been removed from that section by then, but look at the hills. They still look very open, and they are. And that's 1950, which for some of us in the room doesn't sound like it was that long ago. Today, Algonquin Park is contiguous forest, large trees. Logging has not stopped. It continues. We're not here to debate at all today the appropriateness of logging in a park, but it does go on in Algonquin. What I do want to mention to you is the kind of logging that goes on. Frequently, when people talk logging in today's world, they think of denuded BC mountain slopes. Clear-cutting is virtually absent from Algonquin Park. Here we see logging in a hardwood forest in the western part of the park. This is a feller buncher. It has cut off a tree, which it is now lowering to the forest floor. The disruption to the forest is dramatically less than was the case in the past, but logging still goes on there. From our point of view today, the takeaway message as far as birds are concerned is this: no bird species disappears after selection logging of an area. The numbers of particular species dramatically change. Obviously, if it's a bird that is at home in a more mature forest setting, there will be fewer of them after logging. If it's a bird that needs open conditions, early successional stage, they will get much more abundant. But not even one species, research has shown, drops out of the picture entirely. And when the loggers return 20 or 30 years later to cut it again, the forest composition of birds will have changed. Park management changes. Remember, we're talking about a provincial park, a reserve for wildlife, but not just any wildlife. Once the park was established in 1893, it was necessary to have park rangers to patrol. There were a number of people who had trapped in the area prior to its becoming a park for fur bearers, and many of them felt that they'd like to continue. The park ranger's job, in part, was to travel in the wintertime and find these people. This is their accommodation. This is a shelter hut or ranger cabin. They were built at 1 day's travel distance by snowshoe, and the rangers would go out and try to make sure that nobody was doing anything illegal in the park. What we're interested in today, though, from a bird point of view, is this pile right here. These are dead wolves, and they've been killed by the rangers as part of the park's policy to remove wolves because, even though the white-tailed deer was abundant, if you suffer from the Bambi syndrome, you'd think you could always use a few more. From the time the park was established in 1893 until 1958, park rangers killed wolves by shooting, trapping, and snaring. That didn't cause too much trouble for birds. But until the 1930s, and in a little bit after that, we suspect with some rangers, the rangers also used strychnine poison in meat baits to kill wolves. Everything else that ate the poison baits died as well. But there was hope. Maybe they could wipe out the wolves, which was their goal. They never succeeded in wiping out the wolves, but they did kill a lot of other things. This is a golden eagle, which is currently an endangered species in Ontario, and we have a number of records of them coming, finding the poison baits, eating them, and being killed. But the really interesting story involves this bird, and I'm sure you will recognize this as a common raven. In 1922, two ornithologists from the Royal Ontario Museum spent the months of July and August at Brent on Cedar Lake in the northeastern part of the park, and they did not see one raven in 2 months. They were all totally wiped out by the poison. And it took a few years for the population to rebound once they quit using poison, but it did. So this is a major change as far as park management is concerned. When Frank McDougall became superintendent, he stopped the poisoning. Changes in bird numbers. We have quite a bit of good data on this. We want to focus for a moment on the Canadian breeding bird population as a whole. And you will notice that since 1970, on average, the total breeding bird population in Canada has decreased by 12%. If you think I'm making this up, or even if you want to learn more, the report is the State of Canada's Birds 2012, and this is where you can get it online. Here's a graph out of that report. And we're not going to get hung up on this, but the thick black line here going gradually down is all birds together. And that's the 12% decrease since 1970. We can only start in 1970 because we didn't have good measuring ways before that. You will notice that there are birds like raptors, hawks, waterfowl, colonial seabirds, and some forest birds that are actually increasing. But look at these in free fall. Shorebirds, grasslands, and especially aerial insectivores. These are birds that eat flying insects. And virtually all of them have declined by 75% since 1970. 75%. What's going on? Well, there are many things going on, and unfortunately for many species of birds, many factors are operating on a species. It isn't in almost all cases, it isn't one thing we can point to that is doing them in. Habitat loss is obviously very important, and we can fall into a trap of thinking nesting habitat is the most important. It isn't. There has to be habitat along the migration route for stopovers where they refuel during migration. And where they winter also has to provide adequate amounts of the right kind of habitat. Any of these things being disrupted can lead to a decline. We're also seeing in recent decades increased mortality, birds that are dying almost always directly or indirectly at the hands of man. And then even birds that find suitable habitat, both for nesting, migrating, and wintering, don't get killed, get to breed. Research shows that some of them are producing fewer young for some reasons that we will hint at. Okay, there may be people in the room who have cats. I'm not here to denigrate your cat. I'm here to tell you what they're doing. Outdoor cats kill between 1.4 to 3.7 billion with a B birds per year in the US and 100 to 350 million in Canada out of a total population of 10 to 15 billion. So if this upper level, and I'll explain why there's such a spread in a moment, if this is close to being accurate, at the top, that is a big part of the total package. Domestic cats that are indoors most of the time but are let out do a lot of killing. The real problem ones are feral cats that are out there all the time. The reason we have this spread in the estimates is not because we don't know how many birds cats kill. We now have research that's done that puts small cameras on cats. We know every move they make, everything they eat. Some people say, oh, he occasionally brings a bird back. They don't bring back even a small percentage of what they take. They leave it out there, but we know. So if we knew the real number of cats, we could be more accurate. That's why there's a spread. They're a major, major source of mortality. An estimated 100 million to 1 billion birds per year are killed when they hit buildings and structures of all kinds. So 95% of human-caused bird mortality is due to cats and hitting structures. Everything from communications towers to large skyscrapers in Toronto to whatever. Have we got any evidence of this in Algonquin? We shouldn't have too many domestic cats running around, and the last skyscraper in Algonquin was relatively low. So, yes, we do. We've done something called the Ontario Breeding Bird Atlas, and it's been done twice in Ontario, 20 years apart, in the early 1980s and the early 2000s. And this turns out to be a really good tool for us to take a look at the birds of Algonquin Park. When the atlas was done, at least in southern Ontario, these squares, 10 kilometers on a side, were used as the units of search. Each one of these squares had to get at least 20 hours of field work for us to make statistically valid comparisons. And this, yes, indeed, is an outline of Algonquin Park and all of the squares that it takes to get in there. So what we were doing is strictly looking at, let's say, common loon. As soon as we see it once in this square, it gets recorded for PL85. And then in the second atlas, as soon as we see another one again, it gets recorded for PL85. So what we were trying to look at is take a look and see the comparison between the first and second atlases. There are 70 of those atlas squares in Algonquin Park, and we were able to do a statistical comparison of the number of squares where a species was detected in the first versus the second. 56% showed no change. 10% of the species actually were more numerous in the second atlas than in the first. But a full 1/3 of the species showed a statistically significant decrease in the extent to which they were detected in the second atlas versus the first. Let's take a look at some of the increasers, first of all. This is one of those raptors that you saw on the graph. This is a small falcon called a merlin. When DDT was banned in Canada and the United States in the early 1970s, the reproductive failure that it was causing in birds of prey gradually started to improve. And as DDT diminished in the environment, their numbers increased, and by the time of the second atlas, merlins had really increased dramatically in Algonquin Park. So that was a native to the park that did well because we improved the environment. We have aliens. Some of you in Toronto may have seen this bird. I'd be surprised if many of you haven't got some of its calling cards on your feet. In any case, this is obviously the giant race of the Canada goose. There are papers, believe it or not, when they introduced these birds in southern Ontario, the concluding remarks were, if all goes well, someday we may have a huntable population. They increased, but I'm not sure that things all went well. There were none of these detected in the early 1980s in Algonquin. They were in 19 squares by the time of the second atlas. They've spread farther than that since. We have no idea what the ultimate influence they're having is on the flora and fauna, but they are alien. They were never present in the park before. Also true for wild turkeys. The natural range of wild turkeys in Ontario came nowhere near Algonquin Park. But in the 1980s, once we started introducing wild adult birds, the population took off. And they've spread into Algonquin Park. They can even survive there in the winter. They eat everything, flora and fauna. We have no idea what their ultimate effect will be. But there are the increasers. Here are some examples of the decreasers. Decline of birds that eat flying insects. We're going to keep coming back to that. Tree swallow, kingbird, chimney swift, barn swallow, common nighthawk, whippoorwill. Those of you who do a lot of canoeing in whippoorwill country may have noticed that you hear fewer of them. These are very diverse species. They live in different ways. They have one thing in common. They eat flying insects, and they've all declined dramatically from the first atlas to the second atlas, basically in free fall. Let's take a common bird that many of you should be familiar with, the barn swallow. Frequented barns, an excellent name. They also nest on other structures, culverts, bridges, and they were common in Algonquin Park. The red squares in the first atlas show 54 out of 70 squares where they were found. They dropped to 21 out of 70 squares by the second atlas. If we did an atlas again today, there might be 10 to a dozen squares where they are. They are disappearing. This slide is here for two reasons. Barn swallows in Algonquin Park actually nested on natural sites. The other thing is that that's me in a canoe, just to prove that it happened at least once. Many of you will be familiar with the Barren Canyon, I suspect. Up until the late 1990s, at least 20 pairs of barn swallows nested on the sheer cliffs of the Barren Canyon on the east side of the park. Since then, they've disappeared completely. If we look at the Highway 60 corridor, the highway through the southern part of the park, we were able to do surveys in the last few years, and we think that at least 115 pairs of barn swallows nested there up till about 2000. Now there are fewer than 20 breeding pairs, and I think in the next 10 years they'll disappear completely. All of the nesting sites are still there. I suspect the food and the availability of that food are not. What's going on? Why are these birds that eat flying insects in trouble? Well, we don't know. That's the sad part. We don't even know what the past populations of flying insects were. People didn't anticipate insects disappearing. For those of you who have been on canoe trips where insects never disappear, you know exactly what we're talking about. Research is going on. One thing that is suspected is that ultraviolet light may be negatively affecting insect reproduction. And therefore, there may actually be fewer insects out there for these birds to eat. Another thing is that we are getting an increase in severe weather events, and this can disrupt flying insect availability to birds. That can be very important. If the insects are there, but it's very windy or very rainy, or it suddenly turns cold for a couple of days, and you can't get the insects to feed the young, they may die. Ultimately, we get to climate change. And this is my concluding change that I want to talk about. Algonquin birds are primarily migrants. You might see 100 species there if you worked hard, late May, early June. Our Christmas count gets an average of 28 species. Like the people who come to Algonquin Park, the birds leave in the winter. For the most part. This is a male indigo bunting, by the way. And climate change is having some measurable effects, we think, on migrating birds. Just to give you, to work up the sympathy vote a little bit on the work I had to do for this book, we had over 50 years of data like this on these index cards. Nothing on a computer. I probably shouldn't have done it, but I determined that there were actually 10,000 of these cards. And I went through them at least 4 times. So there was 40,000 card viewings. No wonder it took them 20 years to write the book. But they were really very useful data because we had recorded at the Visitor Center the arrival and departure dates of species for over 50 years. And another thing that made it possible for us to work with this data is that most of the records were obtained in the Highway 60 corridor. This is a moose. You'd be surprised at how many people who drive the Highway 60 corridor don't recognize them until they're a hood ornament. Then you notice. In any case, the area from which the records were obtained was relatively small. This is 56 kilometers of highway, and not that far from the highway where most of them. And the effort put in over the 50 years was at least comparable. So unlike some areas that have a tremendous number of birders operating in all times of the year, in Algonquin we had so much of a sort of a controlled database. So what do we do with it? Well, we split the 50 years of data into 61 to 85 and 86 to 2010. Fortunately, the 1986 to 2010 period is when climate warming has been most measurably obvious worldwide, not just in Algonquin Park. What do we find? The average arrival date of 79% of spring migrants was significantly earlier in the 1986 to 2010 period, the second 25-year period compared to the first. I hope I got some time left. In any case, I meant in the talk, not looking beyond that. I'm hoping for that too. At least lunch. In any case, this is a bird that most canoeists should be able to identify. It's a common loon. And for our purposes this morning, the significant thing about this is that it is what we call a short-distance migrant. It doesn't go very far. Basically, they want to get their water not solid, so they're looking for open water. And most Algonquin Park loons probably spend the winter in the Gulf of Mexico and along the southern Atlantic coast of the U.S. So they don't go very far. If we look at the arrival date of common loon, in the first 25-year period, it was April 22nd. In the second, it's April 14th, fully 8 days earlier. Now, loons show up in Algonquin as soon as the lakes become free of ice, or any lake, even part of a lake becomes free of ice. And so if the lakes are still frozen, they're not there. We think our data is particularly accurate about their arrival. And this kind of large change between the first and second periods as far as spring arrival is concerned is typical of short-distance migrants that don't go very far south. Normally birds that are going to start their spring migration are reacting to day length, increased day length. And day length is one thing that as humans we haven't disrupted yet. However, in this case of loons, they are apparently reacting to a stimulus of warmer conditions. And so they take off and start heading north as soon as that happens, and they come back sooner. These are all short-distance migrants. Red-winged blackbird, grackle, blue heron, loon, white-throated sparrow, yellow-rumped warbler. They are all coming back at a statistically significant earlier date in this second 25-year period compared to the first. However, if we look at a bird like this, which is the Canada warbler, one of many warblers we have in Algonquin Park, this is a long-distance migrant. They spend the winter in South America. The thing that gets them heading back in spring is day length, and they do not sense anything going on as far as climate warming is concerned, at least when they start their migration. If we look at the dates for Canada warbler in Algonquin Park, in the first period, the average arrival date was May 20th. In the second 25-year period, it was May 16th, just 4 days earlier. Statistically significant earlier arrival, but far fewer days. And this is typical of long-distance migrants. They are basically coming back almost the same time they always have. Their migration probably speeds up some when they encounter warmer temperatures as they get out of South America and start heading north. So, what do we think is going on in this second period to speed things up? We think climate warming, at least I think, climate warming is the main factor, but it must be admitted that there are more and better birders now, but I think their influence is relatively slight in terms of finding birds sooner than they did in the past. And I say, well, why does he say that? Well, there isn't any reason I can think of why birders should be better at finding some types of birds more than others. I mean, it's consistent that the short-distance migrants are showing a tremendously earlier arrival time, and the long-distance migrants not so much. So I really think there is some truth here, not just observer bias. So what? If they're only going to come back earlier, I'll take my holidays a week earlier at Peely and I'll have no problem. But there's more to it than that. Because arrival time has evolved in birds so that nesting occurs at the optimal time for maximizing production of young. Now, research, it's not just any insects will do. It needs to be insect at the right stage to feed young. So if that stage of insect development starts happening earlier, and a chestnut-sided warbler keeps coming back at the same time, there's going to be a problem, potentially, and they may produce fewer young. And you're lurking. Does that mean my time is I'm getting the hook? I'll move. Climate warming is also causing more frequent severe weather events. So we have these day-and-a-half rainstorms. This can wipe out birds that are having trouble finding flying insects to feed their young. Even the nest of a bird like this yellow-bellied flycatcher may be flooded out. We're getting higher temperatures and more frequent thaws during Algonquin's winters in the last 25-year period as well. Not this year. This is affecting a bird a permanent resident called the gray jay. You'll see it has colored leg bands here. For over 40 years now, Dan Strickland, who is in the audience today, has been studying this bird. The bird does not migrate. It stays in Algonquin. It gets through the winter by eating food that it's stored in late summer and fall. And when you get a thaw in the middle of the winter, it's like the power going off, the food in your freezer melts. That gives them a problem. Gray jay numbers in Algonquin Park have declined along Highway 60 by over 50% since the 1970s, although it seems to have leveled off a bit now. But the gray jay is at the southern edge of its boreal forest range in southern Ontario, in Algonquin, and we think it'll gradually recede northward, and we will end up with fewer, if any, gray jays if we live long enough to see it. Now, this does not mean that birds have totally disappeared from Algonquin Park. It's still a great place to go and see birds, and if you want to know more about it, I encourage you to come. But these changes occur, and it's easy to think of a big green blob on our Ontario road map as somehow being immune from the environmental impacts that are going on in the world, and of course that is not the case. I encourage you to look at the book. I donated it to the Friends of Algonquin Park. All proceeds from sales go to them. They do wonderful work in the human and natural history education of people in the park. Thank you very much for this opportunity.